Welcome to the 905 podcast, and today we're leading off our series of interviews with 905 region candidates to explore the issues and platform promises that matter in our region. Before Election Day, we'll be interviewing a representative from the three leading parties in Ontario, and we won't be asking about whatever is dominating Twitter today. We'll be looking at what the parties say they can do for us and how credible those promises are. So we're kicking off our series with the NDP and their candidate in Hamilton West Ancaster Dundas, who is running to take a seat away from the Liberals. Roberto Henriquez is a lawyer who came to Hamilton as a student and says he fell in love with the city. He's now running as the NDP candidate in Hamilton West Ancaster Dundas, a riding held since 2015 by Philomena Tassi. In Enriquez's legal work, he represents and fights for everyday Hamiltonians, along with trade unions. So welcome to the podcast, Roberto. Delighted to have you on. And as I said, we're going to focus as much as possible on kind of what your party platform is suggesting. And there's a few areas that we think are really important in the 905. And I think perhaps none is more relevant to people in our region than the housing affordability crisis. So perhaps you could kick us off by giving us an outline of what the NDP is suggesting they can do to counter the affordability crunch that we're all seeing.
Yeah, no, thank you, first of all, for having me. I think that is a fantastic question. I'm in the age group, the 30 to 35 age group. Won't give you my exact age so that anyone takes issue with my youth, but I'm in that relatively young age group where I'm seeing a lot of my own friends struggle with purchasing a home, and I'm in the position, as you mentioned, I'm a lawyer, so we are fairly well off. We're in a good position, but nonetheless, had my family not chosen to purchase a home a couple of years earlier, I think we definitely would have faced challenges. I don't know that we'd be able to get into the market the way that things are right now, and the prices continue to increase. And I think that the NDP certainly appreciates that those are challenges. As a society, we have to get to the point where we ask ourselves, are we abandoning that dream where everyone can own a home? Are we moving to something where it's strictly a question of accommodation, whether it's renting or some other form? But I think what the NDP is trying to do is put together a plan that makes housing like an ownership, an option for folks. So of the many issues that are out there, I think it's commonly known that foreign investors have a large role in the Canadian housing market, both for dirty money laundering, the term snow washing, as we've heard coined in the global market with respect to Canadian housing, but also with respect to people who have legitimate interests and are potentially purchasing homes for families or for investment pieces. But one of the things that I think is important to note there is that the NDP wants to bring in a 20% foreign buyers tax for all individuals who are purchasing but are from outside of the country. And I think that is at least one step. Whereas, that may not stop or bring the prices down, it should alleviate some of those upward stressors that we're seeing on housing prices. So that is a key motivator. And I think one thing that's interesting to point there is that the federal government, well, the Liberals at least, have noticed that this is an issue and have identified that foreign buyers create some of those upward stresses, and they've introduced a plan, I believe, in the last where does the time go right now? In the last few days, at some points, but to put in a 2-year ban, I believe, on foreign buyers for housing here in Canada. That is insufficient, right? Like that'll be a 2-year stop, and it'll stop prices from going up from that outward stressor for a period of 2 years, but there won't be anything after that. Whereas the NDP is proposing an ongoing 20% tax. Another thing that I think is important is, as we all know, in 2015, I believe it was 2015, but there were the pieces introduced to the the stress test. Sorry, I was at a loss there, but the stress test for new buyers, and that was designed to keep the market from falling out from under, so that people wouldn't go under in the sense that they couldn't maintain their mortgage prices, default on payments. That was the idea there. But as part of that, I think we'll all recall that the amortization periods were reduced for a large number of folks. So it came down from what it used to be, and now we're at a maximum of 25 years. One of the other things that the NDP wants to do is increase that again, bring it back up to 30 years, so that what you can see is with a 5-year increase, that's another 60 months of payments, which allows individuals to have their prices reduced. When we went back to the question about, sorry, it looks like I see a question there.
I was want to just jump in because we had on last week Mike Moffat to actually talk about this, and not so much to go into the platforms as we said, but we just kind of want to get a sense of how big a scope of this issue is. The one thing that we kind of came away from that discussion with is it's not just a federal issue. And there's one thing that we were talking about was, the things like zoning issues with the municipalities, as well as provincial jurisdiction on giving municipalities the powers to kind of control their own development, et cetera, whereas the federal government could provide the funds to fuel the necessary growth. The one thing I haven't heard from any party, the NDP, Liberal, or the Conservatives, is that how you would work with the provinces and the municipalities to really kind of get an actual national strategy. I mean, we're talking about a lot of money being put into the program from all three parties. They're saying they're going to spend X amount of dollars. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, how do you see the federal government really fitting into? Is this going to be a panacea? You solved all the problem, or is this, down the road you're putting money into it, but it gets stymied because the Ontario or Alberta or Quebec government said, well, no, we don't want to do it this way. We want to do it our way. How do you see the federal government's role in this situation?
I think that's a fantastic question, and ultimately, as you've said, there is going to be a question of jurisdiction that comes up, because questions will arise in terms of local housing strategies or complying with local or provincial mandates with respect to growth over a certain period of time. In Ontario, I know there's a specific growth plan for the province. So I think that they're obviously going to have to there's obviously going to have to be some dialogue, but on the specific strategy, I certainly think that that's something that I myself would have to go back and circle back with on the party and with the party on that. And I'm definitely happy to follow up on that specific question in terms of the strategies that would be involved in dialoguing with the province, which would then download to the municipalities. So if you'll permit me that, I think that there is a discussion to be had on that point. I'm just not equipped to answer that at the moment, and I'd be happy to circle back through our manager to respond to that piece.
Well, we'll do that after the episode. Now, we've talked about home buying, which is obviously a huge component, but in a city like Hamilton in particular, and across the nation, rental, the crisis faced by renters is in many ways just as difficult and has been around almost longer. Now, I notice in your platform that there's mention of co-ops and social non-profit housing, and that's actually an issue somewhat close to my own heart. Tell us what the NDP is suggesting they will do to break through the really chronic shortage in rental accommodation and the lack of rental accommodation being built in particularly in the 905.
Yeah. So I mean, in Hamilton, I believe the statistics are that there are about 5,000 families on the waiting list, if I'm not mistaken, for city housing, as something that's ongoing. So the waiting lists are significantly long. One of the things that the NDP has put into their platform is they are interested in introducing a 500,000 affordable home promise over the course of 10 years. and this potentially touches on Joel's earlier question about the negotiations, the dealings with the provinces and the municipalities. But the commitment is there to have that funding to build a greater number of homes, to make it more accessible for folks who are renting. And I know you did deviate from the point on buying, but I think the other piece, because you mentioned cooperatives, not quite the same, but on the buying front, the NDP does want to allow for more opportunities for individuals to enter into co-ownership models with other folks, where you would have potentially the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation, so the CMHC, covering these types of arrangements that, even in door knocking with individuals, I've seen some people mention to me, they're not spouses, they're not in a civil union, but they're a couple of colleagues or friends who've entered into the market together. But I think by providing those opportunities and creating a system that helps those individuals move into these types of ownership models, that co-ownership will also be a piece that will assist more people to get into the market, especially if it's sponsored, or perhaps not sponsored, but at least supported or fostered by a federal government. So
I can tell you right now that Joel and I could both talk about housing for the rest of the day, but we should probably move on to one of the other subjects. Although it's such an important one, it certainly deserves all the attention. But when we started the podcast, one of the subjects we really wanted to highlight was First Nations and Indigenous issues in our region. As even within a region that is considered to be urban, where we don't necessarily always think that Indigenous issues are a central subject. And almost by coincidence, the whole issue of Indigenous reconciliation has kind of exploded onto the scene in the years since we've been going. So it's good to see that all the platforms have mention of reconciliation with our First Nations and Indigenous people, but in practical terms, we could say to all parties, well, we've heard this before, what's going to be different this time? So, well, let's start off again with you giving an outline of what the NDP is suggesting that they'll do, and then we can dive into the extent to which that would be a fundamental change of direction with regard to how we relate with the First Nations.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned, if you've seen the platform, there is there's actually a full section on this that's quite long as compared to some of the other sections. So I think that what you've seen is that there is a dedication from the NDP to addressing as much of these issues as can possibly be addressed. I think the NDP recognizes that there have been challenges for members of the Indigenous population in Canada. I think regardless of what you look at, whether it's the housing crisis in northern communities, or the level of mold and toxic substances in northern communities, whether it's the drinking water crisis in a number of different communities. I believe we were at 160 drinking water advisories. I think we're still at about 80 or 90, if I'm not mistaken, with some that are in flux but haven't quite been fixed. And now, of course, the bodies that are being found at these residential schools. I think if we look at what the Truth and Reconciliation reports and the calls to action stated, it's a very it's a holistic approach. Whether we're looking at legal issues, whether we're looking at education, whether we're looking at specific housing strategies, it is a holistic approach that's being proposed in those calls to action. And I think the fact that we see all of these specific pieces being put into the platform reflects an understanding that this is it's more than one specific targeted issue. It's conflict in order to recognize that we have a long way to go on all fronts. So in terms of the specific pieces, like I said, there's definitely a lot that can be discussed similar to the housing piece. But one of the first things, we can talk about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, right? The federal government, as it stands now, has in the past said, hey, great, this is a thing that's awesome. We appreciate it, but we recognize that it's non-binding. But it's cool. We want to live up to the spirit of what it speaks to. I think that the NDP government actually wants to incorporate that and make that a formal binding document that we would live under and we would carry on under, which would speak to different obligations with respect to Indigenous communities. So rather than the concept of consultation, which has been something that's developed through the legal jurisprudence, the NDP has spoken about having free, prior, and informed consent. So more meaningful negotiations with Indigenous communities when it comes to questions of resource extraction, or simply use of lands for a purpose that's been determined by the state. Sorry, Joel.
Well, you brought up a good point about the autonomy of First Nations and their respecting treaty rights and what have you. And I think that's in the past mandate of the Liberal government. We saw with them trying to. I'm thinking about the Wet'suwet'en people on the west coast of Canada. They're trying to figure out the Trans Mountain pipeline and whatnot, and that led to a long series of protests across the country. How does the NDP reconcile that with trying to build national infrastructure? I'm not just talking pipelines. I'm talking, roads, hydro dams for power generation. Any big national infrastructure project. If we're talking about reestablishing that connection with First Nations, that we give them the autonomy of their land that they're supposed to have, is the NDP willing to deal with the backlash of maybe a certain First Nations community says, no, we don't want to sell the land, or we don't want to partner with the government to do X project? How willing are you willing to go to kind of establish this new relationship?
Right, and I think that what you've hit on is the is the practical challenges of these types of negotiations. But as a lawyer, one of the things that I can tell you is when you're negotiating with other parties in a dialogue that is that embodies this concept of free and informed consent. I can't ram a specific contract down an opposing party. We need to negotiate on the proper terms, and if it's not acceptable, it's something that's not going to be acceptable. And I think that ultimately, when these discussions start to happen, it'll be different, because in the past it has been sometimes it's been a very superficial concept of consultation. If there's no agreement, there's the opportunity to simply move on and say, well, we tried, and that's the end of the story. But once we start engaging in these dialogues and treating the Indigenous populations and communities as people with their own autonomy and their rights over their specific territories, I think that they're I think that will create a new opportunity to move forward on specific issues that are being tackled, because we'll be treating these communities as their own party with their own standing. Now, I can't speak to what will happen when ultimately those challenges arise, but I do believe that presented with framework, there will be an opportunity to engage fully, and maybe without specifically talking about a specific example, maybe there's routes or logistics that can be worked out that are carved out for specific groups that don't want to be part of a specific infrastructure project. But I think if you're committed to this, then as a government, you should be committed to altering your plans to recognize, as you said, the autonomy of these groups.
I wanted to move on just from First Nations, because there are lots of issues to talk about. It's an election, of course. The one thing that I've kind of noticed, the party, we're starting to get into it finally in the election in terms of the national dialogue, but the COVID-19 recovery post COVID-19, what Canada is going to look like. This is something I think we're finally starting to get into the dialogue with on the national conversation. There's something that I'm looking at your platform right now, and there's something I want to talk about because this is kind of something that's near and dear to my heart because I've been going through issues relating to it. It's high-speed internet and high-speed, broadband options for Canadians, because we've seen with COVID-19 the last 2 years, people have been working from home. This has become, the idea that we're going to be doing more of our jobs from the living room, from a home office, and we need kind of a reliable infrastructure that will enable that. And there was a recent story in the CBC that the majority of Canadians are not getting the high-speed service that they are supposedly paying for from the telecom giants in this country. And I'm wondering if you could maybe speak a bit to how the NDP is going to address it, because I'm seeing there's a pretty big section in the platform just on that concept.
Yeah, and I think this may be one of those that I want to circle back with you on, because there is a big section, and I believe part of the NDP's commitment is to have high-speed internet available and affordable for all individuals, if I'm not mistaken, within a period of 5 years. The specific logistics for that is something that I again, as with the earlier question, something that I would need to circle back on how it is that we want to achieve that, because I don't think those specifics are spoken to. But I recognize, in fact, I think I was having this discussion with myself today. But I, that's certainly something that if we can put it down on the list, I'm happy to circle back.
I guess a bit more of a higher level approach to it, though. How do you feel the importance of this being sorted out post COVID-19? Because that nobody's really talking about it, but I think to the majority of Canadians, they say, if you go on any community forum online, you're going to hear my internet dropped. So my service is spotty. I don't get. I can't download. My Zoom call dropped because my internet went on the fritz. And even we've lost recordings because of internet dropping here. And I just, not in terms of specifics, but how do you see this as an importance for the 905 region?
Yeah, no. So I definitely, and actually, thank you for bringing it back to the 905, because I think I